Hi Year 11. In this video we're going to go over everything you need to know for theme E, which is religion, crime and punishment. This is everything you need to know for this topic. Make sure to take notes or turn the information into a mind map. Feel free to pause the video and watch it at your own pace. So in terms of what we need to cover for theme E, well, we need to know about good and evil intentions and actions, basically ethics, and whether it can be good to cause suffering. We need to know about reasons for crime, including poverty and upbringing, mental illness and addiction, greed and hate, and opposition to unjust laws. We need to know about views in Christianity and Buddhism about people who break the law for these reasons. We need to know about the views in Christianity and Buddhism about different types of crimes, including hate crimes, theft, and murder. The aims of punishment, so retribution, deterrence, and reformation. The treatment of criminals in prisons, corporal punishment, and community service. Forgiveness, which we've already covered in Christian beliefs. The death penalty, and ethical arguments relating to the death penalty, including those based on the principle of utility and sanctity of life. So, reasons for crime then. So, different reasons why people commit crimes. Well, it could be because of opposition to existing laws. So, some crimes are committed in protest about laws that exist which are considered to be unfair or for the benefit of a select few in society. Sometimes laws have to be broken to be changed. It could be because of someone's upbringing, so this might include the environment a person is brought up in, the morals or morality of their family, friends and neighbourhood. If a person is surrounded by criminal activity, they're more likely to do it. It could be because of mental illness, so the state of mind of a person might lead to crime. They might have serious psychological issues with no understanding of right and wrong. They might enjoy hurting others, might have learning difficulties, and might have been a victim of crime themselves. Poverty, so a person might commit a crime because they see no other alternative way out. Many millions live in poverty and some can't afford to buy food. Addiction as well, so a person may have an addiction, for example, to alcohol, drugs, sex or money, which leads them into crime to feed their habit or their cravings. They may even be addicted to crime, for example, stealing. Greed and hate, so emotions are often responsible for crime. Our reaction to what goes on around us or what others have or do to use. We always want more, so maybe we're inherently greedy. People do bad things to us, so hate leads us to take revenge and commit crimes. When it comes to this topic as well, we need to talk about good and bad intentions. So when it comes to crime, so crime is an action against the law of the state, we need to look at the good and bad intentions of the people committing it. Okay, so what did Jesus mean and how does this differ from UK law? So Jesus said, "You've heard it is said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you that whoever has looked at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So this passage again is from Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. It teaches us that our intention is important, not just the action. So Jesus wasn't judging people based on their actions. He was judging them about what was in their heart, is what he said, their intentions. So the Bible warns against having any evil or wrong thoughts and intentions, as well as committing evil actions. So an action that goes against God's law is called a sin in Christianity. Therefore, some things that a non-Christian may see as okay, a Christian may not, and crimes against people are seen as sinful. There is no such thing as an evil person in Christianity, but we can do evil actions or have evil intentions. We all have a tendency to sin because of the fall, but God created people for a relationship with him. So because we're made in God's image and Jesus gave, he died on the cross for salvation through his grace, meaning we can be forgiven and change. Satan is often cited as a reason for temptation and committing evil. However, evil criminal actions are meant to be profoundly immoral or wicked. So for Christians, it's not just your actions, it's your intentions as well. But there's no such thing as an evil person in Christianity. So views on lawbreakers. So Christians are against lawbreakers unless there is a just cause. UK law is obviously there to protect its citizens. So Christians would say, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. The authorities that exist have been established by God, and that is a quote from the Bible. And so it shows that Christians believe the government should be obeyed. However, there are laws that some Christians think ought to be challenged. So the law treats all as innocent until proven guilty, and the court will exist to decide if people are guilty, but it must be beyond reasonable doubt. So if found innocent, they should return to a normal life without punishment. Christians would be against a country where a criminal is not found guilty but still sent to prison because of corruption or something like that. But if found guilty, prisoners will still have rights in the UK. So Christian responses to lawbreakers, well, they would say the punishment should be as severe as the crime because of the idea of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And this doesn't condone violence or torture. Christians should be helped to rehabilitate. So Elizabeth Fry, very famous, was a Christian who helped reform our prison system, and she said the dark cells should not exist in a Christian society. Obviously in The Sheep and the Goats, Jesus said, I was in prison and you came to visit me. So this shows that prisoners ought to be treated with compassion and help to overcome their wrongdoings, not be treated inhumanely. So how do Christians respond to different types of crimes? Well, the first type of crime is a hate crime. This is violent actions against someone because of their race, religion, sexuality, gender, or disability. Christians would say, again, the quote from St. Paul, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. So everyone deserves the same level of respect, equality. Love your neighbour. Treat others as you wish to be treated. Equality and stewardship also apply here as they are key teaching, so this is seen as an atrocious thing to do, so they're very much against hate crimes in all instances. Theft, so taking something that's not freely given. The Ten Commandments does say do not steal, but people may steal for reasons such as poverty, but it's still a crime, so Christians will respond with compassion, but they will still want to see the punishment to help people reform. And then murder, which is the unlawful and deliberate killing of a human being. Love your neighbour again also applies here. You could also use do not kill, do not murder. Both translations would deny unlawful killing. And they would say, well, even murderers can be reformed, but they have still committed a serious crime. So Christians will respect the law of the country, as St. Paul said. He did say, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So they won't break the law, and they will think that governments do have the authority to punish people for crimes because it's God's will. Christians believe the punishment should not be too harsh, though. St. Paul also said, do not overcome evil with evil, overcome evil with good. So they would want to treat a criminal fairly, and they would want to help them reform rather than punishing them in a cruel way. So the different aims of punishment. So AQA want you to know about the 3 aims of punishment. They are retribution, which is seeing that something has been done about the crime. So retribution is almost like revenge. So if someone's done a crime, there should be something equal to that which happens to them. Deterrence, so putting someone off doing a crime in the first place or doing a crime again. Reformation, so this aim is that it wants people to understand why their behaviour is harmful to society and hope that they will change their attitudes. There are more too, so protection is a key one as well, so taking people out of society will prevent harm coming to others. Here are some different examples of each of these aims of punishment. So the first one, the Old Testament talks about something called lex talionis, which is the law of retaliation. So eye for an eye is a Jewish teaching, so that's retribution. Second box, so since Elizabeth Fry, prisoners have been given education and the opportunity to learn a trade, so they're able to get jobs when they leave and to give them something to focus on. Some companies even try and hire ex-offenders. Salvation Army is a Christian denomination who do this as part of their work. That would be rehabilitation. The next one, it encourages Christians to not seek revenge, but set an example, respond with compassion to all people so they can be forgiven and receive salvation. That's obviously rehabilitation, bringing people back to society. Group therapy sessions, individual counselling and treatment, meeting the victims to realise the harm or doing community service, that would be rehabilitation. Retribution, the next one, so the quote, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth from the Old Testament, shows that the punishment should be proportionate to the crime, and it would be proportional retribution. Okay, so the idea of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is also called proportional retribution. Historically, the UK did things like public flogging, putting people on the stocks, throwing rotten fruit, and even public executions. That would be deterrence because it put people off doing those crimes. Many Christians think that's not a good aim of punishment because it can humiliate the person. That would be deterrence. Christians do not agree with deterrence. St. Paul said, "Do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath. Do not overcome evil by evil, but overcome evil with good." That would be rehabilitation. So doing good by God by rehabilitating a criminal. And the last one, the threat of a driving ban puts people off doing a crime. That would be an example of deterrence. So the three aims then: retribution, deterrence, reformation. In terms of Christian views on each of these, for retribution, this is the least positive, and it actually means to see that something has been done about the crime or get your own back. So the Old Testament does talk about lex talionis, so the law of retaliation. They would say in the Old Testament specifically, the punishment is proportionate to the crime. That's where we get the quote, "An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life." However, nowadays this is not interpreted literally, but instead reminds that a person should receive a punishment severe enough to match the seriousness of the crime. For deterrence, it means putting people off committing a crime. For example, the threat of a driving ban puts people off drink driving. People want to avoid their punishment in the first place, or put off repeating a crime as they dislike the punishment. Historically, the UK did do things like public flogging, putting people on the stocks, throwing rotten fruit. Many Christians are against these tactics as they disrespect the person. And the last one, reformation, or rehabilitation as it's sometimes called, but most Christians prefer this aim as it wants people to understand why their behaviour is harmful to the society and that they will change their attitudes. So this might involve things like community service or group therapy sessions, but since Elizabeth Fry, prisoners have been given education and the opportunity to learn a trade so that they're able to get jobs when they leave prison. Some companies will hire those ex-offenders, but Christians who favour reformation over retribution are inspired by St. Paul when he said, "Do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath. Do not overcome evil by evil, but overcome evil with good." So it encourages Christians to not seek revenge, but respond with compassion. So reformation or rehabilitation isn't supposed to be a replacement for punishment, but done at the same time as well. In terms of Christian views about suffering, again, this links with the problem of evil when we talk about Christian beliefs, but crime causes suffering. So whether this is physical, emotional, mental, this suffering can take time to heal and it can have a massive impact on the victims. In the UK, people are offered support such as counselling if they've been a victim, and there's charities such as Victim Support which reach out to people and help navigate the justice system, help people understand how to keep themselves safe, and give them counselling and support. But for many people, suffering is an unfortunate part of living. It could be due to something natural, like an illness, or the way other people have behaved. But whatever the cause, Christians believe they should try and help others who are suffering. But in the Bible even talks about how good can come out of suffering. So in Romans, it does say, "We glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope." And this was written by St. Paul. Obviously, he suffered a lot in his lifetime, and he's really basing his life on the example of Jesus. So the suffering, according to St. Paul, leads to perseverance, and it can grow your character, almost like what St. Irenaeus said in the Soul-Making Theodicy. So Christians feel they should follow the example of Jesus, who helped many who he saw were suffering, and God should help those who suffer. So Helen Keller, a very famous Christian writer and activist, became deaf and blind when she was only 19 months old, and she summed up the Christian responsibility to help those who are suffering. She said, "We are never really happy until we try to brighten the lives of others," and that is from a speech by Helen Keller. An example here of suffering is the Charleston church shooting. So in June 2015 at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church in Charleston, South Carolina, there was a gunman who killed 9 people while they were attending a Bible study. So it was Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white man, who was captured by the police and confessed that he committed the murders in the hopes of starting a race war. So the murders caused suffering to the friends and family of the victims, as well as people from the local community. However, when relatives of the victims faced Dylan Roof in a court hearing, they told him that they forgave him. So Nadine Collier, whose mother was murdered, told Roof in court, "You hurt me, you hurt a lot of people, but God forgives you and I forgive you." So that's an example of forgiveness in the face of suffering, which is a common Christian response. Many people will obviously question why a loving God would allow people to suffer. This is the problem of evil. But it would be wrong to blame God for those actions because Christians believe God gave humanity free will to behave as they choose. So if they choose to follow the teachings of Jesus, they'll want to make good choices. If they don't, they can misuse their free will. So obviously, earlier on in the video, we've said how Christians believe there's no such thing as an evil person. There's nobody who's beyond redemption. But instead, people do things that are evil actions with evil intentions. So the gunman, in that case, chose to disobey God. He chose to have an evil intention and commit an evil action. And in the eyes of Christianity, he was rejecting Jesus' gift of salvation, but being tempted by sin instead. So in the law, there are consequences, such as punishments which are imposed by the courts, but Christians believe that God is going to be the ultimate judge. Any punishment will be given by him as well. The teachings of Jesus will give Christians that guidance to be able to use their free will responsibly, to avoid evil actions and evil intentions. So Christians are opposed to causing others to suffer. Jesus taught that humans should love each other and care for those in trouble, and we can see this through love your neighbour and the golden rule where it says treat others like you wish to be treated. The parable of the sheep and the goats also talks about how if you want to get to heaven, you must do things for the least of these. Yeah, so that's what Jesus says. If you did something for the least of my people, you did it for me. So the quote from Jesus shows that it's the responsibility of Christians to help people, to relieve their suffering. Jesus spoke out against using violence in self-defense. So when he was being arrested, he does tell Peter, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, so that not even retaliation is acceptable. So this is because violence leads to suffering, even if it's in retaliation. However, as no human is perfect, it's inevitable that Christians might be the cause of suffering, often by accident or having their minds troubled for some reason. So having caused suffering, it is important that Christians are honest to themselves, that they are honest to other people and to God, and work at trying to repair that relationship. So during Jesus' arrest, a good example of this is one of the disciples struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this," and he touched the man's ear and healed him. While obviously people can't perform physical healing in the way Jesus did, Christians will learn from this example and try and mend any wrongs that they've done. So why do Christians believe they must help those who suffer? As we're all made in the image of God and are his creation, we do have a duty to help those who suffer, which follows Jesus' example. So St. Paul teaches suffering might be a good thing because he says suffering leads to perseverance and perseverance leads to hope. This shows suffering makes people more resilient and stronger, and Christians will use Irenaeus' argument that suffering strengthens compassion, so it's seen as a test of faith. Or they could use the book of Job. So Job obviously never finds out where he suffers. Think back to Christian beliefs when we spoke about the Theodicies. They might even bring in St. Augustine's Theodicy, where he spoke about the fall and human sin coming from free will. So people will do sinful things that lead to suffering because of free will. Again, Christians have lots of different answers, and those three main theodicies that we looked at in Christian beliefs come up again here, and you can reuse them for this topic of why do Christians believe people suffer. So Christians believe that we should respond to others with agape and not with harm, so we should try and avoid causing suffering. If a Christian causes someone to suffer, they will try and heal them. But what does Buddhism say? Well, Buddhism talks about tanha, so craving. So the reason why we suffer, and obviously the Four Noble Truths are all about this, the reason why we suffer dukkha is because of tanha, craving, and the three poisons of greed, ignorance, hatred, and as attachment to material things. These all cause us to suffer. And these are part of the second noble truth, samudaya or tanha. Yeah, the cause of suffering is tanha. That is the second noble truth. So what are Christian teachings on suffering? The first one is from St. Paul. He said, we glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. So this is basically teaching Christians that good can come out of suffering. In the story of St. Paul, he obviously suffered at the hands of the Romans after converting to Christianity. So it inspires Christians that good can come out of a bad experience. The second example, this is from the Gospels in the Bible, the story of how Jesus had healed the man who had his ear cut off by one of his disciples when he was being arrested. So Christians believe that if they are the cause of suffering, it's important that they work at repairing the damage that might have been caused. So Christians are inspired by Jesus' example of physical healing, as it shows how he healed the wrong that had been done. And the last example, this is the quote from Helen Keller. She said, "We are never really happy until we try to brighten the lives of others." So this shows that Christians believe it's important to try to help others who are suffering and are inspired by the example of Jesus, as well as other Christian role models like St. Paul to do so. So helping others is a fulfilling Christian virtue that brings inner contentment. So the next topic we need to look at is the role of prisons. This image here shows some info from the Prison Reform Trust. So it shows some information about the way we use prisons in the UK in terms of sentencing and the use of custody. So England and Wales have the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe. The prison population has actually risen by 80% in the last 30 years, and it's currently projected to rise by a further 7,400 people by 2024. In England and Wales, we overuse prison for petty and persistent crime. Over 43,000 people who were sent to prison to serve a sentence. The majority had committed a non-violent crime, and nearly 2 in 5 were sentenced to serve 6 months or less. So short prison sentences are less effective than community sentences at reducing reoffending. Community sentences are particularly effective for those who have a large number of previous offences and people with mental health problems, yet their use has been halved in only a decade. Suspended sentences account for just 4% of all sentences. So fewer than 1 in 10 people surveyed said that having more people in prison was the most effective way to deal with a crime. They said early intervention, such as better parenting, discipline in schools and rehabilitation, were more effective responses. So punishment in the UK. So by punishment we just mean a lawful action against someone who's been found guilty of a crime. We have various types of sentencing, so these range from fines for lesser offences to life in prison for the most serious. So a life sentence is 25 years, but you can get given multiple life sentences. Two of the most common types of punishment are prison. So this is a sentence in custody, a secure building where offenders are kept for a period of time decided by a judge, or community service. This is punishment of an offender by making them do unpaid work in the community. It's illegal in the UK, but in some countries they have corporal punishment. So this is the use of physical pain. So what is prison like? Well, prisoners have little freedom. They're locked away for much of the day and they do manual work for little money. Education and training facilities often exist and their use is encouraged, and they may also have counselling. It's based on the type of crime, so serious crime for those involving violence as well. Prison is designed for those sorts of prisoners. Next we have community service. This is made up of community payback, where people must do between 40 and 300 hours of unpaid work. So things like removing graffiti, clearing wasteland, decorating a public space. The offenders will wear high-vis vests to identify them. It can also include treatment programs like medical conditions and alcohol and drug abuse. Counselling and education programs can also be used. It's typically for less serious crimes like vandalism, benefit fraud or minor assaults. And this last one isn't used in the UK, but it's used in other countries. So we have corporal punishment. This means causing physical pain like whipping or caning. It was once legal in UK state schools until 1987 and 1999 in other schools, but it's considered to be a breach of the human rights legislation. It does still take place, for example, in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and caning is used for offences such as gambling or sexual promiscuity. So in terms of what Christians and Buddhists say about each of the types of punishment, for prisons, Christians would say that there needs to be reform. So Elizabeth Fry followed Love Your Neighbour to make prisons less harsh and provide education and training. Prisoners should be treated with compassion, because in Parable of the Sheep and the Goats, Jesus said, "I was in prison and you visited me." The idea of eye for an eye says that the length of time in prison should relate to the crime. For a Buddhist, they would say that there's a time and place for rehabilitation. It links to karuna. They would say the goal is protection. The main aim should be to protect people from harm. For community service, it allows the offender to make up for what they've done, it reforms them, it realises the consequences, it avoids harm, and the Church of England commend this as it helps to reform people greatly. When it comes to community service in Buddhism, it helps to rehabilitate the criminal, it recognises the impact of the three poison, and it changes people through fair treatment. It also addresses the crime. Community service must address the crime to change the person's outlook on it. And the last one is corporal punishment. So Christians would be against this because it lacks compassion, doesn't make people reform. There's a quote in the Bible where it says, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." This means people should be accountable for their actions, so discipline is necessary. But Jesus did not allow violence, because he did say, "He who lives by the sword dies by the topic," like we saw in theme D. For a Buddhist perspective on corporal punishment, harming someone else goes against the first moral precept of do not harm other living things. It lacks karuna, it's not compassionate at all. It doesn't solve the cause of the crime, and it causes dukkha. It causes suffering. In terms of a 12 marker on this, you could get a 12 marker on the role of prisons, you could get a 12 marker on whether prisons are effective, and you could also get a 12 marker like this one on whether criminals should be treated well. So if this wasn't an exam question, here's what you could also include, and these also apply for any question really about prisons or the treatment of criminals in prison. So on the for side, as to why criminals should not be treated well, you could say about eye for an eye. The punishment should be proportionate to the crime, so proportionate retribution. Great word to use in the exam. In some countries like Iran, corporal punishment is considered correct because it goes against the religion of that country. And also St. Paul did say you're subject to the governing authorities. 57% of prisoners do end up reoffending. Maybe prison isn't deterrent enough. Maybe treating them worse would cause that crime rate to drop of reoffenders. Retribution means seeing that something has been done about the crime. Some people dislike human rights for prisoners and want them to suffer the way the victims did. And also it costs £40,000 to keep people in prison. On the against side, so why criminals should be treated well, you could say eye for an eye reminds people not to seek too much revenge. Jesus in the parable of the sheep and the goats did say, "I was in prison and you came and visited me." So showing agape is the right thing to do. One of the aims of punishment is reformation, so showing people the error of their ways. So Elizabeth Fry did help reform prisons and make sure prisoners get treated correctly. Karuna or compassion in Buddhism is a key teaching. So prisoners do require compassion because they've done something wrong. The first moral precept in Buddhism forbids any harm. Hatred is one of the three poisons, and you're just continuing the cycle of dukkha. Community service will see a lower rate of reoffending perhaps, and Christians and Buddhists don't think there are things like evil people, there's just evil deeds. So you could talk about, for Buddhism, everyone's got the potential to be a Buddhahood, and for Christians, God made us so we have a relationship with him. The next topic we need to know about is forgiveness, and this is something that runs throughout so many other topics. We're always speaking about forgiveness when we're talking about Christianity, but forgiveness just means letting go of a fault or wrongdoing. So it's different to reconciliation because you're forgiving someone for the crime that they did. It's not like when we're talking about atonement, when Jesus died on the cross. Jesus isn't forgiving humans; he's dying on the cross to save everyone else. So sin is any action that goes against God's law, and justice is the judgment of persons by a judicial process, such as a court. So when talking about forgiveness, there's two key examples. Anthony Walker is a really good example to use. Anthony Walker was killed in a racist attack, but his dad and his parents did forgive those attackers. Elizabeth Fry as well, because she showed that kindness to those criminals. Another key example is the adulterous woman. So Jesus forgave the adulterous woman when she was going to be stoned to death by the other people around him in the crowd. So Christians do believe in punishment for crimes, as this is justice, but they also strongly believe in forgiveness. So forgiveness is a really important principle for Christians. So Christian beliefs about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a core belief in Christianity. It's one emphasized by Jesus himself, like with the adulterous woman story. Christians are expected to forgive others regardless of what they've done, and in turn Christians believe God is going to forgive them. Many Christians would also argue that forgiveness is not a replacement for punishment. It is possible to forgive someone who's committed a crime like a murder and to believe in justice to be done with a long prison sentence. So the intention is to reform the prisoner so they will not reoffend. So some beliefs of Jesus that you can use when we're talking about forgiveness. So he said, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. He also said to the adulterous woman, go now and sin no more. So he expects people to change when they're forgiven. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. He said that to the people around him when he was being crucified. He said, our Father in heaven, forgive us in our sin as we forgive those who sin against us. Christians will say that regularly as part of the Lord's Prayer. Jesus also said, if your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. So you should forgive people if they do something wrong to you. He said, if he sins against you 7 times in a day and 7 times come back to you and says, I repent, you forgive him. So a key quote is forgive 70 times 7. So Jesus goes on to say that you shouldn't just forgive once, you should forgive 70 times 7. And in terms of Buddhism, so some of the teachings, Buddha said, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burnt. So anger leads to you getting burnt. Karuna and metta. So Buddhists will try to show karuna, compassion, and metta to all living beings. Karma as well is a key Buddhist belief. Buddhists believe that their thoughts, actions in this life generate either good or bad karma, which leads to a good or bad rebirth. The first precept is against harming. So the first precept out of the 5 precepts in Buddhism says refrain from harming life. Buddhists believe that to not forgive gives rise to dukkha. It's taught that those who cannot let go of a real or imagined wrong against them are unable to free themselves from hate, and that they will suffer because of this. Those who attempt to conquer hatred by hatred are like warriors who take weapons to overcome others who bear arms. This does not end hatred, but gives it room to grow. In the Noble Eightfold Path, this gives 8 guidelines to Buddhists on how they should live their lives and includes teachings like right action, right speech, and right livelihood. The last topic we need to know about is capital punishment, or the death penalty. So capital punishment is the execution of an offender by judicial process to achieve retribution, deterrence, and vindication. So don't get capital punishment confused with corporal punishment, because corporal punishment is just inflicting pain to try and cause someone to change their behaviour. Both types of punishment do still exist in the world today, but neither in the UK. So when did we abolish the death penalty in the UK? Well, it was 1968. It was suspended in 1965, and the last one was in 1964. How did we execute prisoners? Well, it was by hanging. How did they execute prisoners in the USA? Well, it's from lethal injection or the electric chair. Some other methods of capital punishment involve things like guillotine, lethal injection, the electric chair, hanging, crucifixion as well. Jesus died by capital punishment, and stoning, which is what was used in the medieval times. So capital punishment is the killing of a person as the punishment for committing an offence. Almost all societies have used capital punishment at one time or another. In the UK, the death penalty for most crimes was suspended in the 1960s. However, some crimes could still have received the capital punishment until 1998, but in reality they didn't. If we look at death penalty by country in 2022, we can see that countries like Pakistan, India, Thailand, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, and Algeria have lots of instances of the death penalty. Even China as well, but China refuses to release the statistics on how many people are killed by the death penalty. In terms of quotes you can use for the death penalty, you can say how Jesus forgave someone who should have been stoned to death, the adulterous woman. The Bible also says the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. So sanctity of life shows that killing is always wrong. Elizabeth Fry, her focus was on reforming prisoners, not killing them. St. Paul also said, do not overcome evil by evil, but overcome evil with good. So the focus should be on compassion and doing something good. Agape as well. Is the death penalty the most loving thing? Arguably no. The quote, eye for an eye, is sometimes used to show retribution can be done by killing. The Bible also says in the Old Testament, whoever kills a man must be put to death. So the Old Testament law did promote the death penalty. Do not kill, but it can also be translated as do not murder. So maybe do not kill would stop the death penalty. Do not murder would also not allow the death penalty. Revenge might be considered an unskillful action in Buddhism. So Buddhists would also stress that mistakes might have been made. An innocent person could have been killed. Killing someone just causes more dukkha, suffering. It goes against the first precept of not harming living things. It doesn't allow someone to be reformed because they're dead. And it goes against the idea of ahimsa, so non-violence towards living things. The Eightfold Path, right livelihood, means that no one should be an executor as well. So you can't, if you're Buddhist, you can't be responsible for killing someone else as part of the death penalty. So, next thing we need to speak about when it comes to the death penalty, and this is specifically mentioned by AQA in the spec at the start of the video, is that we're talking about the principle of utility. So we've already mentioned sanctity of life. We know why a Christian wouldn't support the death penalty, and one of the main reasons is sanctity of life. However, you can also bring in a non-religious perspective, which is an ethical theory called utilitarianism. So this is the idea of greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, was came up with by a guy called Jeremy Bentham, who had a lot to do with the reform of prisons, and he had different ideas about how prisoners should be treated. So some would allow the death penalty as they argue that it protects society. So if it creates happiness for the majority, it should be allowed because the victim's family and future victims would be happy. So according to utilitarianism, any action that does more good, brings more happiness than suffering, is considered a good action. So the death penalty would be allowed based on the principle of utility, of of bringing more pleasure and reducing the amount of pain in the world. That is everything you need to know for this topic. Good luck with your revision, year 11.